literally everything that Washington has done under Trump has made it easier for Russia to carry out the war.
So is this a peace process?
No, it is not a peace process yet. So far, it's a warmongering process. We're saying you should concede to Russia now in exchange for nothing at all.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. So Donald Trump has read out a letter from Zelensky saying Ukraine is ready to negotiate and says he's getting strong signals from Russia that they are ready for peace too. But if that deal boils down to freezing the front lines, Ukraine surrendering its lost territory and American mining companies extracting minerals from Ukraine, is that a real peace and one that might hold? In this new world of strongman politics, has Ukraine been bullied and Russia indulged? And what does all of this tell us about Trump's new world order? Joining me today, the American historian and writer, Professor Timothy Snyder, an expert on Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe, who's written hugely acclaimed books on tyranny and freedom. Tim, thanks for joining us. Now,
I'm very glad to be with you.
You know Zelensky well. In fact, he gives you the top blurb on your latest book on freedom. What do you think is actually going on here? Because after the bust-up in the White House and then the freezing of American aid, the halting of US intelligence sharing, here we have Zelensky thanking the Americans, saying he wants to work under their leadership and negotiate peace. Is he being dragged to the table?
I think he's doing what he has to do, as they've been doing since October, by the way. I mean, the Ukrainians have been nonstop thanking, nonstop praising, nonstop trying to find ways to speak to Trump since before the election, and it's only rational that they tried to do so. On the other hand, what one can't smooth over is the fact that peace won't be meaningful for Zelensky and for Ukrainians unless the deal, and I really hate that word, unless the deal actually involves some sort of treaty in which Ukraine gets the chance to integrate with the West, in which there are some kind of security guarantees. In other words, there's no way to just kind of clap your hands together and imagine that because we acknowledge that Trump has an important role, which of course he does, that everything's going to be sorted out.
So is this a peace process?
No, it is not a peace process yet. So far, it's a warmongering process. I mean, so far, what we have is a Russia which has invaded Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. We have a new American administration, which in every important dimension so far has made things easier for the aggressor, cutting off Ukraine from intelligence, cutting off Ukraine from weapons, taking NATO off the table, suggesting that Ukraine will have to make territorial concessions, not being able to say that Russia was the aggressor. These are all huge concessions, which either shouldn't have been made or should have been kept from the negotiating table, which puts into question whether actual negotiations are in fact intended. Thus far, what we see is Trump making it easier for Putin to carry out a war. And so I really hesitate, although it seems hard, to use the word peace for this process at all, because thus far it's essentially one friend making it easier for the other friend to carry out a war.
What, those friends being America and Russia?
No, more personally, I don't think that Donald Trump has a notion really of the United States or its interests. That's why I use the word friend. I mean, I think it's Trump and Putin personally. And that actually came out in that confrontation last Friday in the White House, where Trump made it clear that Putin had hold of his heart. He believes that he and Putin have gone through hard times together, and this has brought them close together personally. And that it was clear that this actually moves him emotionally more than, let's say, American interests, let alone Ukrainian interests or the stability of the world.
I mean, what people say who've spoken to Trump, world leaders say, is that he passionately wants peace, that the killing disturbs him and he wants it to end. If this amounts to effectively a forced ceasefire, what is the difference between that and peace?
Okay, so let's call that the naive view, and I don't mean that insultingly. I just mean I mean it in the sense of let's assume that Trump is naive, as opposed to malicious in all of this. So the naive view would be something like you can get peace by making the weaker power stop resisting the stronger power that's invading it. So let's say that Trump actually believes something like that. Of course, it's easier for the United States to put pressure on Ukraine than on Russia. But Russia has not actually indicated that it's interested in anything like peace. The Russians, by the way, don't use the word. They talk about negotiations They talk about access to the Americans. They talk about American foreign policy aligning with theirs, but they don't talk about peace. And their war goals the entire time have been very ambitious. Things like replacing Zelensky, overthrowing the Ukrainian government, setting up their own people in power. And so if Trump, and again, this is a naive view, but if Trump really believes that all he has to do is to get the Ukrainians to stop resisting the invasion, he's not going to get peace from that. He's going to get a war in which Russia is more successful in Ukraine, but also a wider war in the sense that other potentially aggressive powers will see this example and have no reason not to start wars themselves. So I don't think Trump is that naive, but if we take the naive view that Trump just doesn't like bloodshed and that he just kind of wants it to stop, if he just tries to make Ukraine stop shooting, what he's going to get is a lot more bloodshed.
His supporters argue that it's too early to talk about security guarantees because this is a negotiation, it's a deal, and the security guarantees come right at the end. I mean, is that more naive view in your opinion?
I mean, I find it really hard for anyone to take that seriously, and I don't think anybody does. Look, by the terms of the breakup of the Soviet Union, by the terms of the main Russia-Ukraine treaties, by the terms of their border agreements, by the terms of Russia's basing agreements way back when, by the terms of every agreement that Ukraine and Russia have made, by the terms of all the ceasefires, Russia's violated it all. Every last thing. Every single piece of paper has been violated. So it's just not logical to tell the Ukrainians, take our word for it, this time Russia won't invade again, especially when Russia has made it essentially transparent that the way they understand any ceasefire or any paper agreement is, we want the Ukrainian army to demobilize, we want the Americans to go away, we want the Europeans to get distracted so we can invade again. So the notion that you can separate a ceasefire or a peace from security guarantees just doesn't make any sense, not in this real conflict as it's actually happened over the last decade and more. And the idea that the Ukrainians should just trust Trump that up his sleeve he has some idea of security guarantees, that you wouldn't really want to trust anybody to say that, but Trump in particular, who thus far has given away to the Russians on every serious point. I mean, it's not that they have particular animus about Trump. It would just be a little bit odd for them to believe that he's going to do that when there's no sign that he's going to do it.
Again, they will always come back and say, well, what's the alternative? Where's your idea for peace? What would be a real peace process then?
Yeah, I mean,
and why would Russia join it?
Well, here's the thing. If Russia has given no sign of joining a peace process now, the fact that Trump uses the word peace over and over again, or that Americans go on television and say words like peace process, doesn't mean that there is a peace process going on. The Americans have gone to Saudi Arabia and they've negotiated with Russians. That's not the same thing as a peace process. The Americans have made it quite clear that they have other things they want to talk to Russians about, and the Russians have done so as well. So we can't start from the premise that there's a peace process underway now, because there isn't. There's an invasion of Ukraine going on now. If you want to get to peace, the obvious, basic, logical thing that you do is you create incentives for Russia to negotiate. That means making the war harder to fight for Russia, which of course the United States could very easily do. We could have tougher sanctions. We could help the Ukrainians more than we're helping. We could make it harder for Russia to fight the war. And that would create the incentive structure for Russia to come to a serious negotiating table, because they'd look at the future and say it's worse than the present. Unfortunately, so that's not my idea. I mean, that's just logic. Like, that's just basic political science, game theory, and military history. It all points in the same direction. If you want an aggressor to come to the negotiating table, you have to make it harder for them to carry out aggression. The problem is that thus far, literally everything that Washington has done under Trump has made it easier for Russia to carry out the war. They're not being incentivized to come to the negotiating table. They're being incentivized to carry out the war. And they make this quite clear themselves. If you look at their media and their official statements, they are saying what I am saying, which is that Trump is making it easier for them to carry out the war.
You spent time in Ukraine and you've written about it in the book. I mean, if in order to bring somebody to the table, you need to make the future look worse than the present, I mean, that is what Donald Trump has done to Ukraine, isn't it, right now? So would you also have to make Ukraine think it can't win and that the future looks bleak?
Well, I think with Ukraine, the calculation is a little bit different because, of course, this logic is the same, but the future that Ukraine is looking at is having to fight Russia without the United States, because that's the future that we've now given them. We haven't offered them a better future than the one that they've now got, right? What we're offering them at the moment is a worse future. We're saying you should concede to Russia now. You should concede our mineral rights to the United States, your mineral rights to the United States, and you should stop resisting Russia in exchange for nothing at all. And so what we're promising Ukrainians is a worse future, not a better one. If you want to get the Ukrainians to negotiate seriously, you would promise them a better future, i.e., number one, make it easier for them to resist Russia. Number two, offer them security guarantees so they can believe that a war won't happen again. And number three, have the Europeans, the British, and others come in and say there'll be lots of private investment, lots of government-supported recovery, membership in the European Union, and so on down the line. That's the better future you can offer Ukrainians. And again, all of that is well within the policy instruments that the United States and other countries have. But giving them, cutting them off and giving them a series of threats and setting up for them a future in which Russia is just going to overrun them is not the same thing as offering them a better future.
Now, you mentioned what other countries might take from this kind of example. Could you just flesh that out a bit? I mean, why would this be so bad for the wider world if Donald Trump, in his terms, stops the killing in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just on that last phrase, if the Russians actually stop killing Ukrainians, that would be a major change. And of course, one that we haven't seen. The United States has made major concessions to Russia. I mean, of the sort that you would usually hold back for very serious matters, major concessions. And that has not altered the Russian war drive in Ukraine at all, not one single bit. So I'm just saying that premise of stopping the killing, right, isn't holding up yet. And they're not even really trying yet. But if we get to a bad piece, which is how I understand your question, if you get to a situation where Ukrainians are, in effect, given the deal that American power and Russian power will overwhelm them unless they accept what is in fact a surrender. If you get to that solution, here are the precedents you're setting. Number one, you're setting the precedent that national sovereignty and the legal world order don't mean anything, because Russia invaded Ukraine in a very straightforward violation of the most basic principles of international law. The second precedent that you're setting is that the aggressor will come out ahead. And you'll be setting that precedent in dramatic fashion, because at the moment, American policy seems to be, and I would love to be wrong about this, but it seems to be to reward Russia with things that Russia's not capable of getting on the battlefield on its own. And the third thing, and perhaps even more significant, is that you're encouraging nuclear proliferation. Because if we get the outcome of the war where Ukraine is forced to surrender, then every medium-sized country is going to draw the conclusion they need to have nuclear weapons to prevent a Russian-style scenario. And that, of course, will be a much more dangerous world. It's also, a world in which Russian and American power is much diminished. But I don't think that the Americans have gotten that far yet.
I mean, in this world in which I suppose you'd be living in a world of strong man politics, you know, as you say, wouldn't every country think that the only way to respond to that is to have populist strong men leaders or strong women?
I mean, let's take a step back from that, because I think there's something really interesting going on structurally. I mean, not positive, but interesting, which is that what the US is doing is it's draining power from the system. So as a set of alliances and relationships and friendships, the United States plus the UK, NATO, the EU, European partners, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and so on, that's as a set, there has never been an assemblage so powerful in the history of the world. What Trump is doing with the strongman politics is that he's breaking up that power structure. And he's creating a situation in which essentially everybody in the West, but also including us, including the US, is less powerful than we were a month ago. So he's draining overall power from the system. But what remains, like as the system drains away, what remains are these rocks, like these things that stick up that were buried by the water before, the strongmen, right? So Russia's now relatively more powerful than it was. China is relatively more powerful than it was because Trump has chosen to drain power from the system. So it doesn't follow from this that being a strong man makes you stronger, is what I'm trying to say. Being a strong man makes people around you weaker, and therefore it might make you feel like you can bully them, but it's not making the US stronger. And so Europeans would be, I think, quite wrong to draw the lesson that a strong man has made America stronger, because it hasn't. And I mean, insofar as Europeans are going to make it through this, it's going to be because the European democracies react to this.
Yes, I mean, I suppose that's what I'm trying to get at in terms of how Europe responds. You know, is Europe also, in truth, weaker because it is still sticking to the ideas of a rules-based system, a world of order, a world with convention, and a world based on democratic principles, you know, and will it find that as time goes on, in a world dominated by Trump, Putin, and Xi, and Modi perhaps in India, that trying to stick to the rules doesn't get you very far?
I think the lesson, honestly, is quite the opposite. If the United States had stuck to the rules, we'd be more powerful than we are. And of course, we're less pleasant to deal with, and we will be, so long as Trump is in charge, but that doesn't mean that we're stronger. We're weaker than we were. And Europe precisely has a chance to be relatively more powerful by sticking together and by not allowing this to continue. So if we do the thought experiment, if Europeans draw the conclusions that they need little Trumpian strongmen, those little Trumpian strongmen will break up the European Union. Those little Trumpian strongmen will spoil bilateral relationships. Those little Trumpian strongmen will spoil trade relationships, because that's what Trumpian politicians do. And at the end of that, you'll be much weaker. I mean, a very specific example would be Elon Musk's interventions into European politics, where you see that the specific idea is to find clients, subordinate partners inside Europe who can do the job of breaking up the rule of law inside Europe. And obviously what Musk is after is not a stronger Europe, he's after a weaker Europe, a more pliable Europe.
Could we then just turn to what Trump is doing within America and within American democracy? He is thriving at the moment on an idea that he is liberating America in some way, that he's making people more free. He's freeing them of government restrictions, of government spending, of waste, of cancel culture, and all of these things. I mean, again, is he, in your analysis, does he make America more or less free?
And thanks for asking that, because this is something that I'm thinking deeply about in the book. And I think the way that Americans think about freedom opened the way for Trump and also for Musk, because we set a bit of a trap for ourselves by defining freedom as just the absence of government, and as defining freedom as just opposing the government, because of course that's wrong. Sometimes you have to oppose the government, but sometimes the government creates conditions for your freedom, as with healthcare, as with roads, as with public schools, as with preserving the peace. The government creates conditions which allow us to be eccentric, unpredictable human beings when you have the right kind of government. And so the real answer is not that freedom is for or against government, it's that government is for freedom. You want to have the kind of government that allows people to be free. But the logic that Trump and especially Musk have followed to the end in the US now is that government's always the problem. Therefore, it's always legitimate to destroy government. No matter what it's doing, right is always on your side if you destroy it. And that's mistaken. I mean, logically, if you clear government out, then you don't get some kind of tabula rasa. What you get instead is oligarchy, because the oligarchs were there. And now, you know, as we were talking about earlier in foreign affairs, like if you drain the power of law from the system, There's still things that are left. There are still these rocks that are sticking up. And then American domestic politics, those are the oligarchs. So what Trump and Musk are doing at home is a bit like what they're doing abroad. They're draining power from the system. They're draining functionality from the system. And that favors the people who never liked the functionality or the law in the first place. So where Americans are less free in the sense that they have ever less of an ally defending them against the corporations and the very wealthy people who wish to exploit them and treat them as objects, but also in perhaps in a much more immediate sense that we're now having infectious disease outbreaks. We're now having airplanes crash into each other. We're seeing the very beginning of what's going to happen when we don't actually have a government which works to serve us. And I think that makes us clearly less free. I mean, and that's leaving aside the whole political part of Trump, which is an important part of Trump essentially declaring that he's above the Constitution and so on.
So what are the freedoms that haven't been cherished, if you like, or are being allowed to let go?
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful way of putting it. I think it's freedom in the sense of allowing to become yourself. It's freedom in the sense of being able to go out in the world and achieve things. It's freedom in the sense of having choices in front of you. When we define freedom just as opposing the government, I mean, first of all, that's a kind of sad story where all you're doing is opposing things. But secondly, what you end up doing is you end up taking things away from yourself and from other people. And very quickly, and this is what's happened in the US, the story of being against the government means actually a story being against other people because you're saying, oh, well, they're benefiting somehow and I'm not benefiting. So now I'm against them. And so if you're free, you're not trapped in some story about us against them. If you're free, you're in a world where you make choices that allow you to flourish and you recognize that your flourishing is consistent with the flourishing of other people. That's what's being taken away from us. All this bullying, all the sense that might is right, all the notion that you have to just repeat what the powerful people say and you don't have to think for yourself. None of that is freedom, of course.
And how do you explain then to people who say, well, if you want to hold on to these freedoms that in my terms are sort of, woke craziness and cancel culture, what about my freedom to say what I think? What about my freedom to, only give rooms in my hotel to people I morally approve of? What about those sorts of freedoms too? What's the answer to what one freedom, does one freedom cost another?
Look, you're asking me now both to describe a very negative world and a positive one. Freedoms generally don't run into each other. I mean, of course, you can come up with examples, but in general, the job of government is to create the conditions where we can all be more free. That's what government is for. And so we can artificially construct these situations where one person's freedom runs up against another's, but those things are going to generate conflict in a system where you've already drained a lot of the functionality and a lot of the freedom out of the system as a whole. As far as being able to speak your mind, of course, that's incredibly important. But the freedom of speech rests on the idea of having free speakers. So a free speaker is a person who's not afraid. And if you look at the top of the American government now, you're not seeing a lot of that. You're seeing people who echo the daily or the moment-to-moment pronouncements of a leader as opposed to a president. And I mean leader in the fascist sense, like they're orbiting around him and saying the same thing. And if you don't say the same thing, then you're punished. And the word cancel culture doesn't even begin to describe that phenomenon, right? It's something much more violent and something much more real than any sort of cancel culture. And if in terms of thinking of being able to speak your mind, it's very important to have a world around you in which you can develop your own thoughts. And so if American policy, for example, is to allow a few oligarchs to drive the entire conversation with social platforms, then we have a problem because then we don't have the local reporters, we don't have the sources of education, we don't have all the things which allow Americans to become free speakers, to have their own thoughts. So that's how I see the issue of free speech. Of course, everyone should have freedom of speech, but freedom of speech is a positive right. It means empowering people.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, the people around Trump are clearly not free to speak their mind or to challenge him at the moment and survive in their posts. I wonder how long or how far away do you think we are from a much more fearful America? We've started to see, the immigration arrests. I wonder whether those sorts of images of people being rounded up, locked up, are going to start worrying other people about their freedoms and how comfortable they feel.
Well, that's the entire purpose of it. The cruelty here is the point. The idea is to is to make of deportation a spectacle. So it's going to be hard, at least at first, for the Trump people to actually deport more people than the Biden administration did. They will. I mean, maybe eventually they will, but for now they're not. What they're doing is they're making a spectacle of it. They're trying to show you that the state can do this to you. And the way you're supposed to react is either to say, oh, yes, I like this because it's happening to those illegals or it's happening to people who are different than me. Or as you say, you're supposed to fear it. It's supposed to be one or the other. Like that's the whole point of deportation, is this kind of spectacle of either of sadism, or a spectacle which generates fear. And I think you're right that this is the important divide, that if America is going to have a chance here, it's going to be because thousands and thousands of people take little initiatives, positively, not just to defend, but to advance the things that they care about. If Americans sit and wait for the next terrible thing to happen, then the terrible things will keep happening and mounting up. And at a certain point, it will seem pointless. But it's encouraging that we're not just a fearful nation at this point, by no means. There are quite a few federal politicians, state level politicians, who are saying interesting and courageous things. There are quite a lot of protests going on. We don't see them because of the aforementioned lack of local news, right? But there's quite a lot of protests going on and quite a lot of creative thinking. And there certainly is. I mean, you see a lot of obedience among the people who really support Trump. You see a lot of repetition of quite ridiculous things, but you don't see an entire society which says, oh, yes, that makes sense. On the contrary, public opinion polls are actually moving in a way which is, I think, quite rational, and which speaks to the condition that the president is creating in the country.
I mean, in Trump's first term, and of course, you had your book on tyranny, which was widely discussed, and you sounded lots of warnings about the direction America was heading in, and the lessons from history and the lessons from fascism. I mean, ultimately, democracy kicked in. Trump lost the election. Biden was elected. They rolled back a lot of the stuff and a lot of the trends that had happened in the 4 years before. I mean, do you think ultimately the American Constitution and the sense of democracy that is instilled in America is too strong to defeat?
That would be a no. So, I mean, I'm not going to, I know better than to try to draw like a wave function with my hands on TV. But if we imagine, democracy, it's not like just something just going up or just going down. There are bumps, there are ups and downs. And of course, we got to a pretty dark place by the end of Trump's first term, where the sitting president tried to overthrow an election, which was an unprecedented event in the U.S. and not that common in general in the world, at least among advanced, wealthy, democratic countries. And he almost succeeded. I mean, depending on how you look at it, he came within a few minutes or a few meters of actually succeeding, at least in throwing the country into constitutional crisis and perhaps in changing the whole system. And that event isn't something which is just behind us, because, of course, the big lie that Trump told, that he won the election of 2020, becomes a conspiracy theory or an alternative reality that a lot of his followers still live in. And living in that big lie allows them to be angry at everybody else. It creates this artificial sense of grievance, which motivates a lot of potentially very negative action. So I wouldn't say we just got over it and Biden undid it, although Biden undid an awful lot of terrible things from the previous 4 years. And no, I don't think that anybody's native sense of democracy is that strong. I think if Americans want to prove that they're exceptional, they have to prove that they're exceptional. The idea that it just comes to you from your constitution or your history or your capitalism or whatever, I think is not only wrong, but it's actually counterproductive, because democracy requires you to be active. There's nothing about the outside world or about outside forces which naturally bring democracy. Democracy has to be about people who want to rule themselves. And what Trump is essentially bringing to the American people is a proposition. You don't actually want to rule yourselves. You actually want to have a strong man. I'm going to give you that chance. And so now we see, right? Now we see whether people like that or whether they don't like that. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion at all. I think it's something that Americans have to prove. I'm hopeful that they can prove it, but it's going to be a matter of action, not a matter of institutions or traditions or anything like that.
Do you understand why so many people are buying it? Given you've pointed out all the reasons why this may be great for the rich and for the oligarchs, but for the common people, there's not a lot to look forward to.
Yeah, there are a lot of reasons. I mean, first of all, the man is he's a very talented, very intelligent, and very charismatic politician. The fact that Trump's wavelength isn't the wavelength of everybody doesn't mean that he doesn't have talent. He does. He's very talented. That's number one. Number two is, for me anyway, the lack of social mobility. American social mobility has basically been frozen for 50 years. And in that situation, it kind of makes sense that your hero is no longer the law-abiding, prosperity-inducing, predictable person, but your hero becomes the hustler and the criminal. You like that he's a hustler and a criminal because you think you have to hustle and commit crimes to get ahead. And so therefore it makes sense to, like, even if you're not going to do it yourself, it makes sense that your hero is a hustler and a criminal, like Mr. Trump. A third thing which is going on here is obviously race in complicated ways, and America's a complicated country, but Trump is saying to some people that you can do better when other people do worse. And that has to do with race, it has to do with gender, it has to do with a lot of other dimensions. But Trump is offering a kind of politics where he's saying, well, look, maybe you could do a little bit better, but in the meantime, let's watch other people doing worse. And that kinds of politics of pain, we know from history can be appealing, that unfortunately that works on humans. So there are some deep reasons why a phenomenon like this is possible, and one could go down the list, but including like incumbency in the two-party system. But all of that said, it's not really going that well for him so far. I mean, they've been very ambitious out of the gate. They've done a lot of damage to the American federal government, but they're not getting a lot of acclaim for it. And as the stock market continues to decline, and as people continue to get sick, and as we recognize slowly that much of the rest of the world, including people who used to regard us as friends, are seeing this very differently, I think they're going to have problems.
Tim Snyder, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for this edition of the Forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.